The Black Panther Party remains and will continue to remain a misunderstood organization. They stood in opposition to America's core beliefs and power structure, and because of this, they were ruthlessly targeted by the establishment. Since then, their story has been forgotten, or worse, purposefully ignored, to create a narrative that cuts corners and distorts the truth. So, I'm going to tell you a more accurate, unfiltered story than our establishment wants us to know. And yes, they actually did some good things. On February 17, 1942, Huey Newton was born into a family of sharecroppers in Monroe, Louisiana. Raised in the oppressive shadow of the Jim Crow South, Newton's early life was shaped by systemic violence and economic disparity. In search of a better future, his family joined the second wave of the Great Migration, relocating to Oakland, California. But Newton's life in Oakland was still difficult. He ran into trouble with the law and was disillusioned by school, stating in his autobiography Revolutionary Suicide, "Not one instructor ever awoke in me a desire to learn more or to question or to explore the worlds of literature, science, and history. All they did was try to rob me of the sense of my own uniqueness and worth, and in the process nearly killed my urge to inquire." But something changed when he saw his brother earn a master's degree. Inspired, Newton taught himself to read, devoured poetry, and studied political philosophy. And this intellectual awakening planted the seeds of his revolutionary ideology. Fast forward to 1961, Newton is attending Merritt College, and he meets a fellow activist in Bobby Seale at an Afro-American Association gathering. They soon became very close friends, protesting, learning, and growing together politically. And this friendship between Huey and Bobby would prove to be very important. They found each other in one of the most critical times in American history. It was an era filled with turmoil, grief, anger, progress, and injustice. Up to this period, the Black struggle in America was one of generational suffering. The Emancipation Proclamation had been signed over a century earlier, yet for millions of Black Americans, freedom existed only on paper. In the Deep South, Jim Crow ruled with an iron grip. White-only signs hung like taunts above water fountains, restaurants, and restrooms, serving as daily reminders that America's promises of equality did not apply to Black people. Schools were separate and profoundly unequal. Voter suppression, enforced through literacy tests and poll taxes, kept political power out of Black hands. Lynching was still a public spectacle, a gruesome warning that any attempt to challenge the racial hierarchy could mean death. But the oppression was not confined to the South. In the North and West, where millions of Black families like Huey's and Bobby's had fled during the Great Migration, the chains of racism took different forms. Housing discrimination forced Black residents into overcrowded ghettos with landlords exploiting their desperation. Police brutality was relentless, an occupying force in Black neighborhoods, serving not as protectors but as enforcers of a racial order. Officers could harass, beat, or even kill Black citizens with near total impunity. By the 1960s, frustration had reached a boiling point. The Civil Rights Movement had won legislative victories. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but the deeper wounds of racial injustice remained unhealed. Poverty, police violence, and systemic discrimination still defined Black life. The frustration felt within the Black community expressed itself in the Watts Rebellion of 1965, when Los Angeles was engulfed in flames for 6 days after police brutalized a Black motorist. The National Guard was called in, but the message was clear. Black people were done asking. The illusion that peaceful protests alone could dismantle white supremacy was beginning to crack. And it was in this America, where Black people were hunted by police, where injustice was the law of the land, and where hope was running dry, that a new kind of resistance was born. Not one of sit-ins and songs, but one of self-defense, defiance, and revolution. And so, in Oakland, California, in the heart of the storm, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale picked up their books, picked up their guns, and founded the Black Panther Party for self-defense. In the first of many bold moves, Huey and Bobby began to police the police. Armed with guns, they followed police officers on patrol, ensuring accountability and protecting citizens from abuse. Newton described these efforts in Revolutionary Suicide, recalling, "I always carried law books in my car. Sometimes, when a policeman was harassing a citizen, I would stand off a little and read the relevant portions of the penal code in a loud voice to all within hearing distance. In doing this, we were helping to educate those who gathered to observe these incidents. If the policeman arrested the citizen and took him to the station, we would follow and immediately post bail. Many community people could not believe at first that we had only their interest at heart. Nobody had ever given them any support or assistance when the police harassed them. But here we were, proud black men armed with guns and a knowledge of the law. Many citizens came right out of jail and into the party, and the statistics of murder and brutality by policemen in our communities fell sharply. And this was as powerful as you'd expect. Seeing friends and neighbors arrested, beaten, or killed was not just a here or there occurrence, but it was the kind of oppression that was an all too familiar part of Black Americans' life. And so, seeing a group of their own standing up against the racial cops in a strategic and defiant way was inspiring. Huey and Bobby were showing that complacency was no longer a necessity, and their defensive role within the community quickly expanded, from escorting high-profile civil rights leaders to attending rallies to prevent unlawful disruptions. And at center stage of it all, guns, which were so effective at keeping police officers from overstepping that the state government moved to ban them. In 1967, the California governor at the time, Ronald Reagan, signed the Mulford Act, banning the open carry of loaded firearms in public spaces. And of course, the BPP were not going to bow down. In protest and marking their biggest move yet, while the bill was being voted on, they marched into the California state capitol with weapons displayed, reading aloud their statement in opposition. At the time, they broke no laws, but the dramatic demonstration led to the arrest of 26 members on fabricated charges. And with that, the Black Panther Party was thrust onto the national stage. While the protest helped the BPP gain massive publicity, the passage of the Mulford Act forced Newton and Seal to reevaluate their strategy. Newton saw the anger and frustration in Black communities, but he also recognized the need to channel this rage into an organized, disciplined group. The brothers in Oakland learned from Watts a means of resistance fighting by amassing the people in the streets, throwing bricks and Molotov cocktails to destroy property and create disruption. The brothers and sisters in the streets were herded into a small area by the Gestapo police and immediately contained by the brutal violence of the oppressors' storm troops. This manner of resistance is sporadic, short-lived, and costly in violence against the people. This method has been transmitted to all the ghettos of the Black nation across the country. The main function of the party is to awaken the people and to teach them the strategic method of resisting the power structure, which is prepared not only to combat the resistance of the people with massive brutality, but to totally annihilate the Black community, the Black population. Despite the Mulford Act, guns remained central to the party, primarily for defensive reasons. Newton understood that without the ability to protect themselves, resistance was meaningless. He later reflected in the essay In Defense of Self-Defense, "There is a world of difference between 30 million unarmed, submissive Black people and 30 million Black people armed with freedom and defense guns and the strategic methods of liberation." And what they were resisting for was encapsulated in their 10-point program, which called for Black self-determination, justice, and economic equality. Their program rejected the idea that freedom could be granted by the same system that oppressed them. Instead, it demanded direct control over Black communities, fair trials by Black juries, an end to police brutality, and economic justice through employment, housing, and reparations. Rooted in revolutionary thought, it positioned self-defense as essential to liberation, asserting that true freedom required both the means to resist oppression and the power to build a just society. However, the Black Panther Party's unwavering resistance and commitment to self-defense made them a constant target of law enforcement. Known Panther vehicles were frequently stopped without cause, a tactic of intimidation that escalated into violence on October 28, 1967. That night, a routine traffic stop involving Huey turned deadly. The details remained contested, but what is certain is that Huey was shot 5 times, a police officer was killed, and another was wounded. In a system stacked against him, Newton was swiftly convicted of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Many saw the conviction as a politically motivated attack designed to silence the Black Panther Party. Newton's imprisonment gave rise to the Free Huey movement, uniting liberal and progressive groups across the country in support of his release. And this campaign would further increase both Huey's and the BPP's fame to new heights. At the end of the 60s, the Black Panther Party had grown to approximately 5,000 members, were selling 300,000 newspapers a week, and had set up chapters in major cities like New York, Chicago, Seattle, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles, all fighting for their own local issues. Its message of empowerment and resistance resonated deeply within the Black community, gaining approval of 90% of Black Americans in big cities. But their revolutionary message didn't just resonate within Black communities. While they were deeply rooted in the fight for Black liberation, they recognized that oppression wasn't limited to one race. At the time, opposition to the Vietnam War was growing. Young men, especially poor men and men of color, were being sent to die in a war that had nothing to do with their freedom. The Panthers saw the war for what it was, an extension of US imperialism, and they built powerful alliances with those leading the anti-war and anti-draft movements. They also allied with organizations of various racial and ethnic backgrounds: the Young Lords, the Brown Berets, the American Indian Movement, and the Young Patriots. Many of these movements looked to the Panthers for leadership and strategy, and in return, these alliances gave the party critical financial, political, and legal support. This fact is often overlooked when the BPP are dismissed as a racist Black nationalist group. They weren't just fighting for themselves, but striving to create a more just world around them. When people talk about the Black Panther Party, they often focus on their militancy, but what's far less discussed is their commitment to community survival, focused on rebuilding a system that had failed Black Americans for generations. In 1968, the Panthers created the first People's Free Medical Clinics, which were an alternative to the broken, discriminatory healthcare system that left Black communities neglected. Black hospitals were often underfunded, understaffed, and lacked proper medical equipment, and diseases like sickle cell anemia, which disproportionately affects Black people, were largely ignored by the medical establishment. To combat these inequities, their clinics provided free sickle cell anemia screenings for a range of other diseases, vaccinations, prenatal care, and general medical services, all for free. Some chapters even operated a free ambulance service, and it didn't stop there. In 1969, they launched the Free Breakfast for Children program, feeding tens of thousands of kids every morning. Other programs included liberation schools, shoe drives, community security patrols, and free food distribution. These programs filled gaps left by the state, addressing important issues the government simply didn't care about. The Panthers also acted as a mediating force, working through rent struggles, resolving local disputes, and addressing gang violence and drug concerns. In many ways, the party became a surrogate for the state, providing support and advocacy for those left behind. In opposition to King, Huey didn't believe the white leadership in America would or could address the issues faced by Black Americans. He was a strong advocate for self-determination, meaning Black Americans should take control of their own fate, not aiming to change the establishment, but creating a structure that had their own interests at heart. And it worked. Crime, health, police brutality, poverty, all saw significant improvements. And all of this progress, at the hands of an organization that stood in opposition to the racist power structure, made them a target. The FBI, federal government, and local police all set their sights on taking out the BPP. They raided breakfast programs, stormed medical clinics, intimidated businesses into cutting off donations. Every effort to uplift Black communities was met with state repression. In response, Huey issued Executive Mandate No. 3, ordering party members to defend their homes and offices against warrantless police raids, leading to full-scale, deadly clashes. This escalated to the BPP becoming the first ever target of SWAT raids, with the police detonating explosives on the Panthers building and over 5,000 rounds of ammunition being exchanged. The Panthers tried to stand their ground, but ultimately were forced to surrender. The federal crackdown further intensified under President Richard Nixon, whose law and order agenda expanded federal support for policing and surveillance in order to suppress Black liberation movements. However, for the Panthers, external pressure was never the greatest threat. J. Edgar Hoover headed the FBI's COINTELPRO, a covert operation designed to neutralize subversive organizations, and in the 1960s, it was in full force. They tapped phones, planted informants, spread false information, and turned members against each other. But its most ruthless act came on December 4th of 1969.
The Black Panther Party, that they can do anything they want to us. We might not be back. I might be in jail. I might be anywhere. But when I leave, you can remember I said with the last words on my lips that I am a revolutionary. And you're going to have to keep on saying that. You're going to have to say that I am a proletarian. I am the people. I'm not the big. You got to make a distinction. And the people are going to have to attack the big. The people are going to have to stand up against the big. That's what the Panthers are doing. That's what the Panthers are doing.
At just 21 years old, Fred Hampton wasn't just a leader. He was charismatic, brilliant, and had the power to unite Black America. He was exactly what J. Edgar Hoover feared, a Black Messiah. And that made him a target. COINTELPRO planted an informant as Hampton's bodyguard. In coordination with the FBI, they had him drug Hampton with sleeping pills. Hours later, the Chicago police stormed his apartment, firing nearly 100 bullets with Hampton laying unconscious. He was shot twice in the head at point-blank range. This wasn't just a raid, it was an execution, and it revealed the merciless extent to which the US government would go. While external attacks intensified, internal fractures were also beginning to form. The COINTELPRO program worked to discredit and dismantle the Panthers, actively sowing division within the party, spreading misinformation and turning members against each other. And it was working. At the core of these divisions was a growing conflict between the Central Committee and the local chapters. While the national leadership in Oakland prioritized maintaining alliances and political support through moderate action, many rank-and-file members demanded more radical means. And many had high hopes for Huey Newton's release from prison in 1970 after his conviction was overturned. Many Panthers anticipated that Newton would stand defiantly against these pressures, directly confronting the police and government for their repression. However, he was much more committed to advancing the party's social programs. He knew direct action was risky. The party needed funding, and no donor would back an organization openly warring with the establishment. Eldridge Cleaver, one of the party's most vocal and important leaders, saw this shift as a betrayal of the revolution, and the divide became irreparable. Cleaver broke away, forming the Revolutionary People's Communication Network, which embraced a more aggressive, confrontational approach. By the mid-1970s, the Black Panther Party was a shadow of what it once was. Affirmative action and increased Black political representation drew focus away from radical movements. Even foreign revolutionary governments, once allies, softened their stance, normalizing relations with the US. By the early 1980s, one by one, the remaining chapters fell. The party's influence faded, its legacy buried beneath years of government suppression and internal fractures. They were defeated, they were dismantled, their revolution unfinished. The Black Panther Party was never an anti-white movement. It was a pro-Black movement. It wasn't fueled by hatred, but by a desperate need for self-determination, for dignity, for survival. They didn't believe the white power structure could or even wanted to help the Black community. And how could they? For generations, the government had failed them. The same system that promised liberty and justice for all had enslaved, segregated, and brutalized them. Yes, laws were passed, leaders made speeches, but in the streets, people still lived under the weight of poverty, police violence, and systemic oppression. And even now, in the present, The rage that erupted during the George Floyd protests was the same frustration, the same pain, the same demand for justice that had ignited the Black Panthers decades before. Our society still isn't equal. The government still isn't doing enough to undo the damages of history or to counteract the injustices of the present. If the Black Panther Party were here today, they wouldn't just be fighting for history books to tell their true story. They'd be in the streets, demanding better healthcare, access to food, clothing, and education. They'd be fighting for community-led policing, for real political power, for the right to determine their own future. And maybe, just maybe, we'd be further along in that fight if our curriculum didn't erase them, if our propaganda didn't twist them, and if the truth wasn't buried beneath decades of fear and lies.
Revolution has come.